Hi, Andrew from SACS. Psychosocial risk legislation is in place across Australia now. This is a brief explainer. Two things people are noticing about this psychosocial risk legislation. Thing number one is that employees are becoming increasingly conscious of it, and we're starting to see lawsuits and complaints based on this legislation. Important thing to understand. Secondly, we're getting to the point where we're starting to get some case law, actual court findings, or from other jurisdictions on this legislation, and so that's going to really bring it to life in a legislative sense. Let's explain to you what it means. Firstly, workplace management of psychosocial risk is part of the deal. You're supposed to identify hazards, you're supposed to assess psychosocial risks, you're supposed to implement control measures, and you're supposed to regularly review the success of these measures. So what do we mean by psychosocial risks? Here are some examples from WorkSafe Victoria, but state by state and territory by territory, they're very similar across Australia. Low job control, so where people are very disempowered at work, that's a psychosocial risk. High and low job demands, that might surprise people. High demands, people get that, too much pressure at work. What about low demands, where the job is so boring or so disengaging that can be a psychosocial risk? This is a fact. Poor support, poor organisational change management, poor organisational justice. A big driver of psychosocial well-being is a sense of justice, and where people feel that there is no justice, that is a psychosocial risk. Low recognition and reward, particularly where it's falling foul of comparisons with similar sectors, even if it doesn't fall foul of something like an award in a statutory sense. If it's paying considerably less than what most people in that sector could be expected to be paid, then that is a psychosocial risk. Low role clarity. Role clarity is a crucial thing. It's a crucial driver of people's well-being at work, and it's often done very poorly. Poor workplace relationships, particularly if people are feeling socially excluded by other people, that's a psychosocial risk. Poor environmental conditions. Remote and isolated work. Remote doesn't mean just working from home, by the way. There is no evidence that people who work from home in general are worse off from a psychosocial point of view. But if the work is very isolated, that can be a psychosocial risk. And obviously violent or traumatic events, if people are exposed to those, that is a psychosocial risk. So people often talk about stress and its relationship to psychosocial risk. And in fact, there are two types of stressors that apply at work. One is good stressors. These are called challenge demands. So the pressure of workload. It might surprise you to hear that as workload increases, in general, people's well-being increases. If people have workload that's too low, that is a psychosocial risk of itself, as I mentioned earlier. Pressure of processing lots of information, pressure of problem solving. And what that's saying is that if people have psychological challenges in their work, that's actually a good thing. It creates high levels of well-being. The things that create low levels of well-being, though, are hindrance demands or bad stressors. They're things like lack of social support, job insecurity, inadequate resources, role ambiguity, role conflict, where Mary Smith is asking you to do a particular thing and Bill Jones is asking you to do the other, and they seem to have similar levels of authority. Role conflict is a big problem. And so that the stress that people experience at work really falls into two categories. Pressurised stress, where the job is getting on top of people, and also psychological distress. Psychological distress is where the work is causing people to be anxious or depressed or vulnerable. Now, true psychosocial well-being could be said to be a balance between the good things and bad things which happen to you at work. And I think when people think of psychosocial well-being, they think only of the bad things. But in fact, if you get enough good things, that can counteract some of the bad things. So I'll talk about the work of John Gottman to talk about the ratio of good things that happen to you and bad things that happen to you. Gottman was a researcher into human relationships, and what he discovered is this thing called the magic ratio. So widely spread across the world, on average, if you get 5 or more good things in a relationship for every one bad thing, then you tend to stay in that relationship. Now, Gottman's research was specifically to try to create more harmonious interpersonal relationships, but in fact it's been shown to apply much more widely. And so if you go to work and you get 5 good things that happen to you for every one bad thing, then that can create a more positive psychosocial environment. And for most people, the break-even point's somewhere around 5 to 1. Of course, it varies individual by individual. So let's not just focus on the bad things at work. Here are some good things that you could focus on at work. Empowering skilled leadership, creating clarity about behaviours, about performance standards. developed with the input of staff. So empowerment is a really key thing. If people get empowerment, one of the things that we know is that minimises the probability of psychosocial damage. Supportive leadership, where leaders are kind and friendly and helpful to staff. Solution-based approaches rather than emotion-based approaches. In other words, positivity. There is no doubt about it. If you're a leader who is dispositionally positive versus dispositionally negative and cynical, the positive leader gets a much more positive outcome in terms of psychosocial well-being than the negative or cynical leader. Exercise. It's nearly the best thing you can do for physical and mental health. Exercise is a fantastic thing to create physical and psychological well-being. And then things like encouraging people to connect, and maybe even in organisations where you create communities of mutual interest, maybe projects or interests outside of work or whatever, consciously avoiding isolation, and where an organisation contributes to that, that can make a big difference to people's levels of psychosocial well-being. Diet has a massive impact on people's psychological well-being. So if people are eating healthy, non-refined foods rather than sugary, fatty foods, that makes a big difference to their well-being. How about where organisations sponsor healthy foods at their events? And finally, of course, drugs and alcohol are a negative from the point of view of psychosocial well-being. So there's a brief wrap of what the legislation says that you need to do from a psychosocial well-being and a psychosocial risk point of view, and some suggestions about the kinds of things you might turn your attention to optimise psychosocial well-being. As ever, if this content is of use to you, then don't hesitate to like and subscribe.